It was a cool afternoon when I arrived at the hospital. The place was big, modern, and nothing really stood out about it, except for the fact that something felt off. I'd been an investigator for a while, solving all sorts of cases, missing persons, fraud, even a few murders. But this one was different. The hospital had reached out to me after a number of weird disappearances. First, it was morgue bodies vanishing. Then a few workers disappeared. Security guards, night staff, even some of the regular hospital staff. It didn't make sense. This was a well-known, reputable place with a good reputation. But the more I dug, the more I realized something was going on. Each time someone went missing, it seemed like a body had also disappeared from the morgue that same night. I pulled into the parking lot, got out, and made my way to the entrance. As I walked through the doors, I was greeted by Ellen, the head nurse. She looked like she was in her mid-40s, her face showing signs of exhaustion, but her eyes were alert. "Glad you could make it," she said with a tight smile. "We've been waiting for someone who could get to the bottom of this." I nodded. "I'll do my best." Ellen led me down a corridor that was oddly quiet, considering it was a hospital. The walls were white, the floors were clean, but everything had this clinical, almost sterile feel to it. We passed a few nurses and orderlies who barely acknowledged our presence. It was like they were in their own world, going through the motions. She stopped in front of a door marked Morgue and then looked at me seriously. "Before you see anything, I need to explain a few things." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of things?" Ellen pulled out a piece of paper and handed it to me. "These are the rules. They're not suggestions. They're important." I took the paper, and the first rule jumped out at me. Rule 1, never enter the morgue after midnight. I gave her a puzzled look. "Why?" She just stared at the door for a second, her voice quiet. "You'll understand soon enough." I skimmed the rest of the rules. Rule 2, if you hear footsteps near the morgue, never follow them. Rule 3, never be alone in the hospital at night. Rule 4, if you see any blood drops, don't follow them. Rule 5, if you notice the morgue doors opening on their own, don't go near them. Rule 6, never try to investigate the bodies. I looked up at her, trying to gauge if she was serious. Ellen's face was hard to read. "What exactly is going on here?" I asked. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "We've seen it all. People disappearing, bodies vanishing, and no one can explain it. Some staff have left, some have refused to come back, but no one talks about it openly. We all just follow the rules." I tucked the paper into my pocket. "And if I don't follow the rules?" She looked at me with a mix of concern and warning. "Let's just say the last investigator who didn't, well, he's not here anymore." At that point, it was clear she wasn't joking. The air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on us. But I wasn't about to back down. I'd dealt with strange cases before, and this was no different. Ellen led me to the morgue, and as we passed through the sterile hallway, she filled me in on what had been happening. Every night, something weird happens. I've seen bodies disappear right in front of me. I've heard footsteps when no one is supposed to be there. We all follow the rules, and it's the only thing that keeps us safe. I nodded, though I was still skeptical. "And you think there's something supernatural going on?" Ellen didn't answer right away. She seemed to choose her words carefully. "I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, it's real, and we've all seen it." We reached the morgue doors, and she gestured for me to take a look. But before I could step inside, she stopped me. "Just remember, don't break the rules, and don't ask questions about the bodies. Some things are better left unknown." I gave her a small nod. "Got it. I'll stick to the rules." As I stepped into the morgue, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, hidden just out of sight. But I was determined to get to the bottom of it, no matter what it took. I spent the next few hours walking around the hospital, trying to get a feel for things. Most of the staff kept their distance, but I managed to speak with a few people. Some were reluctant to talk, but a few gave me some interesting tidbits. One of the security guards, Mark, was the first to hint at something strange. He pulled me aside in a hallway, looking around like he didn't want anyone to overhear. "You don't know the half of it," Mark said, lowering his voice. "It's always the night shifts. The missing people, the weird sounds, the bodies disappearing. It started with the morgue." I pressed him for more. "What do you mean?" What's happening at the morgue? Mark rubbed the back of his neck, glancing down the hall nervously. I don't know, man. We hear things, footsteps, tapping, like someone's walking around when there shouldn't be anyone. And the bodies, they vanish. They just disappear. I could see he was trying to hold it together, but it was clear he was shaken. And what are you supposed to do? He looked at me, dead serious. Just follow the rules. Don't go near the morgue after midnight. Trust me, it's not worth it if you do. I didn't need him to say more. The vibe in the hospital was heavy, and it was clear the staff knew more than they were letting on. I moved on, my mind racing with questions. Later, I spoke with Dr. Langley. He was calm, collected, and didn't seem fazed by anything. But when I asked about the disappearances, his tone shifted. The morgue isn't just a morgue, he said, looking at me like he was weighing whether to tell me more. People go missing there. It's part of the place. I pushed him further. What do you mean? What's going on? He didn't answer right away, but his eyes flicked toward the door like he was making sure no one was listening. It's not just a job for most of us here. It's something you have to understand. If you don't follow the rules, you vanish too. I could tell he wasn't going to say much more, so I changed the subject. And the staff? What do they think? Most are afraid, he said with a small shrug. They follow the rules. It's easier that way. The conversation left me with more questions than answers. Something was off, but I wasn't sure what. The hospital had a strange way of operating, and it didn't seem like anyone wanted to talk about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening here was much bigger than a few missing bodies. Night settled over the hospital, and the quiet was unsettling. The usual hum of the day was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. The lights flickered overhead as I walked the halls, keeping close to Mark, one of the security officers. We stuck to the rules, knowing better than to wander alone at this hour. But even with company, the air felt thick with tension. As midnight approached, we found ourselves near the morgue, standing by its heavy metal doors. That's when we heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, but unmistakable. They came from inside the morgue, echoing down the hallway. Mark froze, his face going pale. His hand shot to the radio clipped to his belt, but he didn't speak into it. Instead, he whispered to me, his voice tight. Don't follow it, he said. I've heard those steps before. They don't belong to anyone alive. A shiver crawled down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to look through the glass window into the morgue, but I forced myself to look away. The rules were simple, and I wasn't about to break them. I nodded, trying to push the feeling of dread away. Let's just go. Mark didn't need convincing. He turned on his heel and started walking quickly down the hallway, and I followed, but we couldn't escape the sound. The footsteps didn't stop. They followed us, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was walking right behind us. Tap, tap, tap. The sound grew distant, but it didn't fade. It felt like it was always one step behind, the rhythm never breaking. Mark's pace quickened, and I did the same, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. We didn't speak until we were far enough away, and even then, neither of us dared to mention the footsteps. The silence returned, but it was different now, charged like something unseen was watching us. The rules were clear, and I knew in that moment they were there for a reason. The night was quiet again, and I was walking through the hospital halls, trying to keep my mind clear. I had learned quickly that the longer I stayed, the more I noticed, details that didn't make sense. That night, something caught my eye. Blood drops. At first, they didn't seem like much, just a few small, dark spots on the floor. But as I took a few steps forward, I saw more. The trail was fresh, like someone had been dragged through the corridor. The blood was thick and dark, almost black in the dim light, and it led me down a hallway I hadn't noticed before. A cold chill ran down my back. The rules were clear. If you see blood drops, don't follow them. But something about this felt off. I couldn't help myself. I had to see where this trail led. I took a deep breath and started walking, keeping my eyes on the floor. The drops led me further down the hall, around corners, until they stopped in front of a storage room. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to catch the light from the hallway. I hesitated for a moment, my pulse racing. The blood trail led right inside. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking under the pressure. My hand trembled as I stepped into the room, but I was ready to face whatever was inside. It was empty. Empty except for one thing, a single bloodstain on the floor, leading into the darkness of the far corner. No body, no sign of a struggle, just the stain, dark and still. I took a step back, my heart thudding loudly in my chest. The blood was real. There was no denying that. But where had it come from? And where the hell was the person, if there was one, who had been dragged here? The silence in the room felt suffocating. I turned and left quickly, my mind racing with questions. The blood drops weren't a random occurrence. They had to mean something, but I couldn't make sense of it. Not yet. I knew I couldn't let it go. Whatever was happening, I was getting closer to the truth. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized. I had already crossed a line. Something wasn't right, and I was beginning to wonder if I was already too far in to turn back. That night, something felt off in the air, even more than before. The hospital was unusually quiet, and I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing at the clock on the wall. It was just past midnight, and I had been pacing around the halls trying to make sense of everything. The morgue was still the epicenter of the mystery, and no matter how many rules I followed, the answers seemed to elude me. As I passed the morgue for what must have been the 5th time, I noticed something strange. The doors. They were slowly opening on their own. I stopped dead in my tracks. The first rule was clear: never enter the morgue after midnight. But the doors were ajar, almost beckoning me inside. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I approached them, my stomach tightening with a mix of dread and curiosity. I knew what I had to do, and I knew it was a mistake. But I couldn't resist. I had to see what was happening. I pushed the doors open, the cold air of the morgue hitting me immediately. The faint scent of antiseptic and decay filled the space, and the fluorescent lights flickered above. The room was dark, the shadows stretching across the cold metal tables where the bodies lay. I walked inside, ignoring the second rule as well. Never notice the morgue doors opening on their own and go in. I was breaking the rules, and I knew it. But there was something about the morgue, something that called to me, urging me to investigate. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I walked slowly between the tables, counting the bodies. Everything seemed as it should, stiff, still, lifeless. But there was an unsettling feeling that lingered in the air, like I was being drawn into something I wasn't prepared for. I checked each table, confirming that all the bodies were accounted for. I spent a good while moving around the room, checking every corner, every shadow. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing moved. I locked the morgue doors behind me as I left, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what. That night, I spoke to the morgue staff, asking them about the body count. The workers seemed uneasy when I asked, but they confirmed that there hadn't been any discrepancies. All the bodies were accounted for. I left the morgue feeling unsettled, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. But I knew deep down that something wasn't right. It wasn't until later that morning that I received a complaint from one of the staff members. Another body had gone missing. It was the same story as before. Another disappearance, and no one had seen anything. No signs of struggle, no clues to explain what had happened. I found myself back in the morgue that night, unable to shake the feeling that I had missed something. I couldn't stop thinking about the bodies, the strange occurrences, the rules I had broken. I had to get to the bottom of it, even if it meant confronting whatever was happening in this place. The night was darker than before, the silence more oppressive. I walked into the morgue, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The moment I stepped inside, a sense of dread settled over me. It felt colder than it had earlier, even though the temperature hadn't dropped. The silence was thick, suffocating. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling, like something moving under a sheet. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes darted to the tables. I stood in the morgue, the silence almost suffocating. The door had closed behind me with a heavy thud. The air felt colder than usual, and the quiet was unsettling. I glanced around, making sure nothing looked out of place. There was the usual row of body bags lined up, a quiet hum of the refrigeration units, and the sterile smell that always seemed to hang in the air. But there was something off. I took a step closer to the first body bag. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I had to check. As I reached out, I saw it. One of the body bags was shifting ever so slightly, almost like it was breathing. But that couldn't be right. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. I had a lot of experience with death, with the stillness of bodies, but this was different. I took another step back, my eyes scanning the room more carefully. That's when I noticed the second body bag. It moved too, just a little. Now my heart was pounding. I had to investigate, but I knew I was breaking the rules. The morgue doors had opened on their own, and I had entered after midnight. Both clear violations. But I couldn't just leave without checking. I checked the infrared sensor I had on me. I'd brought it in earlier that day, just in case I needed something to give me a bit more clarity in a place like this. It wasn't the most sophisticated equipment, but it was good enough to pick up heat signatures. I had it set up next to the body bags, just a small handheld device connected to a monitor I had hidden in my coat pocket. It was an easy enough setup, and the last thing I wanted was for anyone to know I was snooping around. I turned on the infrared sensor and held it up. The screen lit up with a few faint, static-like images at first, but something caught my eye. A heat signature was moving through the room. It wasn't a typical heat signature either. It wasn't a person, not in the usual sense. It looked wrong. It was like something was slithering through the air, darting between the body bags. I froze. I thought maybe it was a glitch in the sensor, but the screen kept showing the same thing. A shadow, a blur moving from body to body. My mind raced. The bodies were moving, but not in any natural way. This wasn't a person. This wasn't supposed to happen. I glanced back at the body bags. They'd stopped moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. I had to figure out what was going on, and I wasn't about to leave the morgue until I did. I checked the infrared one more time, and the screen was still showing the same bizarre movement. It wasn't a malfunction. It was real. Whatever was in here was taking the bodies. I could feel the weight of the situation pushing down on me. The rules I had ignored now seemed more important than ever. I was here, breaking them, and I had no idea what kind of force I was up against. But if I left now, I might never know the truth. I stood frozen in the morgue, the infrared sensor pressed to my eye. The screen flickered with the faint, ghostly image of movement. The heat signature was barely visible, just a blur sliding between the tables, vanishing and reappearing in almost impossible ways. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. The creature, whatever it was invisible, but not to the sensor. The infrared picked it up like a shadow, cold and eerie. I could see it moving, but it wasn't a person. It was something far worse. It slithered between the bodies, taking them one by one, without leaving a trace behind. No blood, no disturbance to the body bags. It was like the bodies were simply disappearing into thin air. I watched as the creature moved with purpose, its shape hard to define, just a cold, creeping signature that made my skin crawl. Whatever it wasn't just feeding, it was collecting the bodies. I couldn't fathom how or why, but there was no mistaking what I was seeing. The bodies were vanishing, leaving no sign of struggle, no marks, nothing. I started to back up, trying to keep my composure, but my mind raced. I had seen enough movies and heard enough rumors to know that this wasn't normal. But the thing was, I couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason for what was happening. No one else would believe me if I told them about the heat signatures or the invisible creature taking the bodies. I had to act, but there was no clear way forward. I couldn't tell anyone, at least not yet. I needed more evidence, something concrete. But all I had was the infrared sensor and the strange, unsettling image of a creature moving through the morgue, feeding on the dead. I shut off the sensor and took a step back. The air felt colder than it had a moment ago, and I could feel the weight of the room pressing in on me. I wasn't sure what I was up against, but I knew one thing for sure. I was the only one who had seen it. And if I didn't figure out what it wanted, I might end up just like the bodies. Over the next few days, I threw myself into research, scouring every bit of information I could find about the hospital, the morgue, and anything that could give me a clue about how to deal with the creature. I was running out of time, and I knew that if I didn't act fast, the bodies would keep disappearing, and worse, people would continue to vanish too. I spent hours going over the hospital's blueprints, trying to map out its layout in my mind. The morgue, the storage rooms, the hallways, all of it. I needed a place where I could trap the creature and use its weaknesses against it. After countless hours of reviewing, a single thought struck me like a bolt of lightning: the chemical storage room. The hospital kept a storage room full of sterilization acids and other highly flammable chemicals. If I could use that to my advantage, maybe I could force the creature into the open. The heat from those chemicals would be enough to destroy it, but I had to make sure I didn't let it escape. I started setting up my equipment, taking it one step at a time. The infrared sensors were a start, but I needed more. I brought in heat-sensing cameras, ones that could detect even the smallest fluctuation in temperature. I rigged up a few motion detectors around the morgue, hoping that the creature would trigger them when it moved. I knew I had to be careful. The rules were still fresh in my mind, and I couldn't afford to slip up. I kept reminding myself not to break the routine. I had seen the consequences of ignoring the rules firsthand. The last investigator who had failed to follow them had disappeared without a trace. I set the trap carefully, making sure everything was in place. The chemical storage room would be the bait, and I planned to lure the creature inside. Once it was in the right spot, I would release the chemicals, using the heat to trap it. I had to carry on like everything was normal, like I wasn't setting a trap for something I still didn't fully understand. It was a dangerous game, but I had no choice. The creature had to be stopped, and I was the only one who could do it. As the sun began to set, and the hospital quieted down for the night, I made my way to the morgue, my heart pounding in my chest. Tonight was the night. I just hoped I wasn't walking into something I couldn't escape. So, after days of setting everything up, tonight was the night. I'd seen enough to know this thing had to be stopped. It had been taking the bodies in the morgue, and I wasn't about to let it continue. The only way I could think of to end it was by burning it alive. The hospital had this chemical storage room filled with flammable acids, perfect for what I needed. I had everything ready, and I knew the plan. The creature wasn't visible, but I could track it with the infrared sensors I had, which were picking up its heat signature. I waited until the morgue doors creaked open on their own, then slipped inside, gripping the sensor tightly. Scanning the room, I finally saw it, a faint heat signature lurking near one of the empty tables. I needed to get the creature to follow me into that room. The problem was, it didn't exactly chase after anything. It was invisible, moving quietly like a shadow. But there was one thing I knew for sure: it was drawn to heat. So I decided to use a trick. I made sure the infrared sensor on my handheld device was working. I dropped a few small blood stains along the hall, knowing the creature would be drawn to the scent. It had been feeding on the bodies, so the smell of blood would definitely get its attention. I didn't go overboard, just enough to create a trail, leading it straight to the storage room. I moved quickly, making sure I wasn't being followed. The last thing I needed was for the creature to catch wind of my plan before it was too late. I slipped into the morgue, making sure the creature knew I was there. I could see the heat signature on my sensor, faint but growing stronger as it came closer. Once I got the creature moving in the right direction, I quickly darted into the storage room, making sure it followed the trail of blood. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I heard its movement behind me. The creature was getting closer, but it couldn't see me. It was only following the heat. I reached the door to the storage room and stepped inside, heart pounding as I put the final part of my plan into action. The creature was right behind me, following the trail, unaware of what it was walking into. The setup was simple. I had placed an open container of flammable chemicals near the door, with a fuse leading to a spark trigger I could ignite manually. It wasn't long before I heard the faint rustling. The creature had entered the room. I stayed as still as I could, waiting until I was certain it was in the center. My hand trembled as I struck the ignition trigger, and in an instant, the chemicals erupted into a fiery explosion. Flames surged across the room, engulfing everything, the heat forcing me to step back into the hallway. I watched as the fire consumed the storage room, the glow illuminating the sterile walls outside. The air was thick with smoke, and for a moment all I could hear was the roar of the fire. The fire blazed fiercely, consuming everything inside the storage room. I stood just outside, watching the inferno, convinced I had finally put an end to the creature. The heat was unbearable even from where I stood, and the smell of burning chemicals filled the air. As the flames began to die down, I let out a shaky breath. It was over, or so I thought. Even though the creature was destroyed, I couldn't shake a strange feeling. It was like its presence still lingered, its soul roaming the halls of the hospital, unseen but unmistakable. I don't know when or if it might reappear, but something deep inside me told me this wasn't truly the end. Thanks for watching. Comment the word investigation if you want more spine-chilling investigation stories. And don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales and eerie mysteries.